What is this thing doing back in here again? Well, I had to do something while the Gliptol dried to keep production rolling, and this was it. I went out romping for data logs, and after a happy little pig-rich 30 psi pull, the very next time I started up my car, my wideband O2 sensor was dead. That doesn't work out very well for the drivability of your car when you're simulating your narrowband signal off the wideband sensor in order to maintain your fuel trims. Anyone with an Innovate wideband O2 setup knows that from time to time you have to calibrate the O2 sensor. Calibration requires removing the O2 sensor from the exhaust and doing an open air procedure, one that I'll do later in this video, and then reinstalling it. It's just one sensor screwed into the exhaust, right? Sounds easy enough. Well, on this overstuffed hodgepodge bucket of bolts where nothing lines up, nothing is that easy. I'm draining the radiator and removing intercooler pipes to show you what I'm up against here. My wideband sensor is slightly taller than the stock sensor. I have an aftermarket dumped O2 housing that doesn't leave the O2 sensor pointing in exactly the same direction as the factory O2 housing. What this leaves me with is an O2 sensor that points directly into the back of the power steering pump, and even though I can fit an O2 sensor socket in here by itself, it's so crowded that I can't fit a ratchet on the back end of that socket. It's just not in an easily serviceable location on my car. I know someone out there thinks that they could get the O2 sensor out a different way, and no, explosives aren't an option. But trust me, I tried everything else. I don't want to remove the entire hot side to do this on the workbench because my oil and coolant lines don't leak and I want to keep it that way. I don't want to waste oil return gaskets because with 4 DSMs I need all the ones I've got. You'd think that maybe I could remove the O2 housing and pull the O2 sensor out on the workbench. This is where removing 4 fasteners turns this into more than an intermediate job, because it requires more complicated sockets and extensions than most do-it-yourselfers have in their toolkits. It takes wobble extensions, long extensions, universal joints, swivel sockets, and both short and deep well 14mm sockets because there's a nutted stud holding the O2 housing on. This is where the car reminds you that it hates you because the last nut and stud are recessed behind that O2 sensor that you can't get out. And no socket, swivel, universal joint, wrench, or anything else in your toolbox is going to reach around that sensor and fit over the stud unless you remove the O2 sensor first. If I don't feel like breaking all the gaskets and hoses loose and pulling the whole hot side off in one big piece, then no matter how much I don't want to mess with that power steering pump again, I've got to do it. I can't be putting myself through this every time my O2 sensor craps out on me. This has to be the last time. The reward I get for taking all this stuff off is trying to put it back on, and it's not easy. The car's not very useful to me if the parts that I'll need to frequently service are buried under a half dozen major components that take hours and bleeding to remove and replace. So if this is how it's going to be, something's got to change. The O2 sensor is fuel fouled and blackened from that rich 30 psi pull. It's sad that's all it took, but before I sort that out, I'm going to move my bunghole. Look, we've had this discussion before. The definition of a bung is noun, a stopper for closing a hole in a container. Every fuel-injected car has one. This was sold as a stainless steel O2 housing. Most of it is, anyway. The tubing appears to be 304 stainless because my shop magnet doesn't like to stick to it. But it sticks to the exhaust flange, turbine flange, and bunghole. You don't weld mild steel to 316 stainless, but you can weld mild steel to 304 stainless using a 309L welding wire or filler rod. I bought both mild steel and stainless steel bungholes just in case, but I'm going to use the mild steel bunghole. Here you can see the alignment of the O2 sensor versus the stock O2 housing and why it was aligned so far back into an inaccessible place. After center punching it and giving it a dimple so that I can make a slightly flatter surface to weld the bunghole against, I first start by drilling a small hole using a small, easily replaceable drill bit, then use a bigger bit, and then use my step drill bit. What curvature of the pipe that I didn't remove with the hammer I'll make up for on the back of the bunghole. It doesn't take much. I made a mark before I removed the O2 housing to designate about where I want my bunghole to be. I just need to have enough room to get the torch in here, and I need to be able to access the downpipe flange holes so that I can put my exhaust on. That means I have to compromise a little bit with where I actually made my mark, but oh well. This spot should still work out. Normally I'd just plow through it with the step drill, but stainless is hard. No need to destroy all my sheet metal tools on this material. After I've got a hole the size I need, I'm going to do all the cleanup and preparation to make both pieces fit flush together. On some materials, like aluminum, this work is more critical than on others. What I've got here is pretty forgiving, but still, the more cleanup and prep you do in advance, the better your bunghole will look in the end. So after a little grinding, fitting, filing some more, creating a beveled edge around it, and then marking it in several places to line up its orientation, it's time to weld this housing a new bunghole. Yeah, it's a little sloppy because we had to MIG it. No room for TIG work here, and I actually didn't even do the welding, but the extra spratch around it builds character. This weld looks perfect, and the Hyundai's no beauty queen anyway. You can see how this changed the location and the angle of the O2 sensor dramatically. I could have replaced the center section gasket with a new one because I've got a few of them laying around, but I figured it's a steel gasket, it's not that old, and I have a wire wheel, so why not clean it up and put it back to use. I hit the O2 flange on the turbo with some emery cloth, and now I need to put all this crap back together again so we can test the O2 sensor location out and see if she'll do. I sure hope so, because now I can't change it. I'm just putting the bung that came with my bunghole into the stock bunghole location, and that seals everything up nicely. Let's have a look at her. Oh, heck yeah, that's the stuff. I've got a ton of room down here. Looks like I could reach up from the bottom and install it and remove it without even jacking the car up in the air or even opening the hood. Plenty of room. Time to reinstall the exhaust, gasket, and fasteners that I cobbled together at the hardware store. Install the power steering bracket, heat shield, pump, and belt. Then bolt the high pressure line back down. Install the radiator brackets, turbo intake, exhaust heat shield, J-pipe. You might remember I made my own gaskets for boost leak prevention because none of the store-bought solutions work to seal this particular car up. They're a pain to clean off the flange, but they work really well, and I've had to do this so many times that I've run out of material to make a new gasket. So this time around I've invested in a proper roll of gasket material instead of using an uncoated cardboard shoebox lid. Of course, this solution was $6 more than the free shoebox, but if you counted the cost of the shoes, it was a bargain at $6. Instead of the paper fiber gasket material, I'm using the rubber fiber gasket material, which is pretty thick. It's actually an upgrade from cardboard. With the gasket out of the way, back to reassembly. I applied a thin, nearly transparent coat of RTV to both sides of the gasket surfaces. I wrestled it in place and then honked it down nice and tight. With that now in place, I can install the intercooler pipe and fill it back up with coolant again so we can move on to the sensor calibration. Totally a reasonable amount of work to have to go through for a sensor calibration, right? This is most definitely a job that you'd want to do at least every 3 months just because you've got your bunghole in the wrong place. At least now the mechanical aspect of this problem's been remedied, and I can move on to the procedure I need to do that caused all of this in the first place. My installation location for the wideband controller itself puts me through a few extra hoops regarding access to the indicator light, but the procedure for doing it is really simple otherwise. With the wideband O2 sensor removed from both the O2 housing and the O2 circuit, turn the wideband oxygen sensor controller box on, and after its power on self-test, it finds there's no O2 sensor and blinks an error code 2. It's 2 red blinks every 2 seconds like a heartbeat. Run it in this state for at least 30 seconds or 16 pairs of blinks, and then power it off completely. Go back to the engine bay connector, plug in the O2 sensor and leave it in open air. Lay it on something metal or heat resistant because it's going to heat up. Go back inside the car and power on the wideband controller to complete the calibration cycle. This is how long it takes in real time. You have to do this process every time your calibration is off, or every 3 months, or whenever you replace an O2 sensor. You can't do the calibration with the O2 sensor installed in the exhaust. It has to be in open air. And whatever you do, never connect or disconnect the sensor while the O2 controller is powered on. That would be bad. That's everything you need to know about maintaining your LC-1 or LC-2 wideband's health. Once the light is solid green, turn all the power off, and as long as the car's power stays off, you can unplug and install the wideband sensor back into the exhaust, reconnect the harness, and secure the wires without losing your calibration. When you power it on the next time, it doesn't know it was ever gone, and that way it holds it. If you accidentally power it back on with the sensor disconnected, you have to start the calibration process all over again, that's all. So after a quick cleanup to secure the wires in the connector from hot things and spinning belts, I can finally start this car.
It's taking an awfully long time to warm up. I'm running late because I pulled fuel out after the O2 sensor pegged 7.5
heck's going on with that shirt?